welcome back to You're All Doomed, the podcast that successfully sliced and diced its way through Jason, Friday the 13th, part 13, roughly 13 minutes at a time. I'm one of your hosts, Brian.
I'm the other host, Greg.
So as we usually do at the end of each season, we do a bonus episode where we kind of like recap what we've been talking about. And with this season in particular, there's a lot of things to talk about. And I think the logical starting point is, how did we even get here?
First, the Earth cooled. Then, no. Well, yeah. I mean, why did we do this? Why did we come up with our own movie? And it started with a joke you made over a text message. I don't even remember the context. Do you?
Yeah, I think it was over a weekend, like a Saturday or Sunday, and you had sent me a text message that was just kind of like a random article about the ongoing legal issues between Sean Cunningham and Victor Miller, and basically that they weren't making any progress. And your little side comment to the article was, these guys really are just guaranteeing that we're never going to be able to talk about a Friday the 13th part 13. And I just jokingly, without even thinking about it, just responded, we should just make up our own part 13 and talk about it on the podcast. And I sent the text, and before the sound effect of the text being sent had completed, I was like, that's actually not a bad idea. But I didn't respond to my response. I just kind of left it at that. And within a minute, you responded and you were like, that's actually not a bad idea.
Yeah. Right. You saw the three dots as you were yeah.
And that kind of sent us down. We started kind of texting back and forth furiously about well, what could we do? And how would this work? And what does that really mean? And we realized that it was we were just getting a little bit too excited about it too early on. So we're well, let's just think about it and then we'll resume this conversation later. And I think we just ended up starting an email thread and started kind of just going back and forth about could we do this and would it work? And what are the logistics of it? And
this was even back, I think we hadn't even done season 10 yet.
No, it was a while. We had a while to go before completing the whole existing movies. We were, like you said, probably maybe in the 10th movie. So it's not we were getting ready to wrap up the podcast and we were trying to figure out what to do. It was just a random, you found an article about the legal case and then I responded, and this had been gestating for a while, but the actual story was something that didn't come up until much later. It was we were more concerned about would this work from a logistical standpoint on a podcast? How do we make up a movie, especially with the format that we have, which is 13 minutes at a time? How does that work? And so we were just kind of discussing whether or not the general idea would work, and it would be much, much later before we actually sat down and started talking about what an actual story would be.
Yeah, and then it was sort of we once it became clear this is going to be our 13th season, it'll be part 13, and we were sort of that's kind of have to it's going to have to happen. And so then some other things popped up that could have been our 13th season. At one point, some of the people who made 13 Fanboy reached out to us asking if we were going to cover their movie, and we were well, we could do that as a full season of 13-minute episode, of 13-minute screen chunks, but we really wanted to save season 13 for our quote-unquote movie, and so we just kind of had that reserved. And then, it was a question of, our initial plan had been to get on mic, have basic outlines to work from, but, just basically big, here's what happens at the beginning and here's what has to happen at the end. And then basically spitball this movie on mic to each other. And we were together in February with that plan. That was going to be our approach. And I mean, I think it was 10 minutes or so into the attempt, and it was just not it wasn't working. It was we it was going to be too painful for the listener to hear us fumbling our way through this story that we hadn't worked out with each other ahead of time. And so we said, hey, well, why don't we just spitball this together here, in person in February? And we worked through it. We kind of just basically like a writer's room locking itself in the conference room for 2 days or whatever, and hashed out this story with all the beats, so that when we got together again remotely, a few months later to actually record the episode, it was a much smoother progression of telling the story. And it would have been, it was, I think, a lot less painful for the audience to hear in this fashion, rather than, having us constantly being like, well, wait, no, what if we did this instead?
Yeah, it was way more than 10 minutes. I feel like we were close to like 45 minutes to an hour, at least, of recording time into the story. And we were struggling. Like, we had, like you said, we had a general outline, and the idea was that we didn't want the outline to be so specific that whatever we were talking about on mic seemed scripted, because like that just seems boring. Like, we didn't want it to seem like we were just reading from something that we had pre-established. We were like, we wanted there to be some freedom to it. We wanted there to be the flexibility to kind of like change things on the fly. And so we thought like, well, if we just come up with like a general outline, then like Greg and I have known each other long enough that we can like, we'll figure it out. Like, oh, like, don't worry about it. We'll figure it out. And like, that was kind of our mentality. And then we got like 45 minutes into it, but realistically we only got like maybe 5 minutes into the story. And that's what, like, we were really, really struggling, because there was a lot of like us, because like we thought part of the fun would be figuring out on mic. And we thought that would be fun for the listener to hear us kind of like, well, what if this happened? And then what if that happened? And kind of figuring it out. But
or surprising each other with something.
Exactly. And kind of like capturing those moments organically on the recording. But what we found was we were getting really hung up on, well, hold on. Is this a conversation for you and I, or is this a conversation for the podcast? Mm-hmm. Like, what's on the mic? What's on off mic? And we were getting so hung up on that, rightfully so, because there was a lot of like figuring things out that we were just trying to decide, like, would this be interesting for the listener? And we were getting really, really hung up on it. And that's why we just were not making progress. And we got basically through the first scene in 45 minutes, which is not far at all. I think you had gotten up to like go to the bathroom or something, and we just kept recording. Not while you were in the bathroom, but like
we're doing that right now. So I mean.
You stepped away and you came back, and I feel like something, like you had like an epiphany in the bathroom, as you often do. And you were like, hold on a second. And you were like, what if the recording, like, because we were in person in February, like you said, and you're like, what if this time together is just us fleshing it out, like not concerning ourselves with it being a podcast recording, like just recording it simply for our purposes and using it as like an audio outline of what we're thinking. And that way it takes all the restraints off of concerning ourselves whether or not this is interesting for the listener or whether it's just interesting for us. And then it was just like, let's just talk. And we just happen to be recording it. It's just like dictating a meeting or something.
Yeah, or like if we'd been in a car for a couple hours and we like got into this thing of like, hey, well, let's plot out a movie, and that's sort of what the core of our show is, I think, is that it's much more just us having a conversation that we would have. We just happen to be recording it. We've had discussions about Friday the 13th for decades now, and we simply decided to put this one on mic.
Right, and that, like, taking those kind of those restraints off of us, where we were just like, we weren't concerning ourselves with what people would think of the recording. It just allowed us to just sit down and to shoot the shit and talk about like what would be a cool Friday the 13th part 13. And it still ended up being like 3 hours worth of recordings, but we were making progress, and we weren't concerned if there was like 10 minutes of downtime where we were staring at the ceiling trying to figure out what came next. It was just us sitting around, and like we would come up with an idea, and then we'd realize that the idea didn't work, and then we would back it up, and then we would start over, and we'd come up with a different idea. But in the end, what we ended up doing with those like 3+ hours of recordings is we used that and transcribed the best bits and created an outline out of it. And that was invaluable to what we were trying to do, because then we had something that we were in agreement on, because originally the outline that we had was just kind of like, well, I'll write this part and you write that part. And it just like, that could have worked, but it wasn't working for this purpose. And so this was like an actual conversation where the plot was being generated organically between two people having a conversation. So it was just like taking those pieces, transcribing it, putting it into an outline, and then we had something to work with. And then we're like, let's use this outline to actually record the podcast. And that's what we ended up doing.
And then we could go back in, we waited a couple of months and we could go back in, and there were, things that we had to flesh out, so we could pull little surprises on each other that way. But at least we knew where we were going with the story, which was, we had a spine and we had the basic, the major beats all planned out. And it was actually much more fun. That first 45 minutes was kind of frustrating and rough. And once we abandoned that approach and just turned it into a bullshitting session, it was tons of fun, because then it's like, I threw something out that was okay, but then you're like, well, what if we did this instead? And then it made it, like, oh, well, that's perfect. And so there was a much better exchange, and it was much more natural.
Yeah. One of the, I think the earlier ideas that we had in terms of like developing the outline was like, okay, Brian, will write the first scene, and then I'll hand it off to Greg, and Greg will write the second scene, and then I'll write the third scene. And in theory, that seemed like a good idea. But what was happening was like, I would develop a particular scene expecting something to happen, but that didn't happen because you were coming up with something else, which was the point. Like, you were supposed to come up with something else. And I'm like, well, then hold on a second. That like completely derails my idea. And we didn't get very far with that before we realized like, hey, this isn't working, because we both had ideas and we were both introducing characters, but then the other person didn't incorporate that character. And then we're like, well, shit, this isn't working. So that's why the idea of you just like, let's just record us figuring it out. Like, it was just such a brilliant idea, because that's exactly what we needed to do. And I think I wouldn't say we wasted time, but there was a lot of time that we spent trying to do it in a more collaborative way, where we weren't having a conversation. Like, we were sharing a document online and trying to like bounce it back and forth to each other. And it's just not the same as having a conversation. And those recordings of that actual brainstorm that ended up being like 3+ hours, as I was listening to them, like, I enjoyed the shit out of listening to them. And I think you did too, Greg. And I was even telling you, like, as I was going through, because like we ended up breaking them up into like a few chunks, because we did take breaks to like go to lunch or whatever. And I was like, this might actually be fun to release someday. And I'm still on the fence about that, because I can't decide, like, is this just entertaining because it's just Greg and I bullshitting our way through an idea, or would this actually be interesting to the listener? And I don't know. And maybe we'll release it down the road. I really don't know. But it's like,
I mean, we're skating like we've already done a masturbatory episode. Now we're doing a masturbatory about a masturbatory
about masturbating.
Episode. And then we're going to have, we're going to release the background of all this, and then we can have a commentary track about that. And like, how much jerking off are we going to do? Have a refractory period, for God's sake.
But you know what I always say, this is a free podcast, so you'll kind of take what we release. But
season 14, hear us talk about season 13.
But yeah, it was a fun process, and those recordings, at least from the standpoint of Greg and I, were interesting to listen to, because there was this like palpable excitement where there would be like 10 or 15 minutes where we were struggling. We're like, well, what's next? Like, I don't know what the next scene is. Like, how do we get out of this scene, or how do we introduce this character? And then suddenly something would pop into our head. We'd be like, yeah. And then there would be like all this energy again, and we would build off of that. And there would be this momentum that would carry through for like the next 20 minutes or so. And then we'd struggle again. But it was just a really fun process. Like, anyone that's interested in like the creative process and understanding that it's not just great ideas all the time, I think this, like, those recordings are just a great example of like how, like, even when you're struggling, like, we would change the subject and we would suddenly, something would pop into our head that would be a great idea, and then we'd get back on subject and that would be fun. So it was just like an interesting kind of like experiment that happened to be captured on mic.
So what are your initial thoughts on what we came up with, what we wound up with?
Well, I'll start by saying that this season, more than any other, was the biggest challenge to edit, because for anyone that's interested in how we do these podcasts, like the first 12 seasons, the 12 movies that we talked about, there's actually very little editing that goes into the episodes. Like, Greg and I, we take our own notes, we talk about what's going on, we're prepared when we go into them, and there's not a lot of filler. It's a lot of anything that's being cut out is typically like, hey, I got to go take a pee, or hold on a second, where are we again? Just like little things like that. But I don't think there was ever a case where like you and I had a conversation that where I'm like, I'm not going to include that. It was just like, maybe there was a joke that was for you and I that I would cut out. But point is, there was very little editing. But for season 13, there was a shitload of editing. And that's because, like, yes, we had an outline to work with, but there was still a lot of things that we had to figure out. And there were things in the outline that we realized, oh, wait, that doesn't quite work, or we need to explain that. And so there was a lot of like what we would call off mic conversations. We were still recording it, but it was more just like, for me and Greg, we were like, well, hold on a second. How do we get Ginny from point A from point B, or why is Megan in this scene? And hold on a second, we already had a scene that did that. And so there was a lot of that. And so from an editing standpoint, we would have these episodes that were, from a recording standpoint, they'd be like well over an hour long. And we just had to assume, as we were talking and having these conversations, that was enough time. We're like, oh yeah, we covered enough. And then I'd edit it down, and that's why you'd end up with like a 14-minute episode. We're like, well, shit, we really didn't talk about anything in this episode. It was a lot of us like trying to figure out like why we were in a particular area, or why this character was doing this certain thing. So from that standpoint, it was frustrating, because I feel like we could have done more. We always knew that like the quote unquote 13-minute chunks were going to be arbitrary, because there is no movie to actually be talking about. But we were like, we want to make sure we're covering enough content per episode that it seems like we're covering enough content. And there was, I would say, most of the episodes, I felt like we were covering enough, but there was a couple that seemed really, really short. And that was just because all we had to go off was the counter in GarageBand. We're like, well, we've recorded an hour, it's probably enough. And it just didn't turned out to not be enough. So that was a little like disappointing on two parts. One, for us, because I felt like, well, maybe we could have gone into more detail. Like, personally, for the two of us, like, if we're going to enjoy this experience, like, we could have gone into more detail. But then also for the listener, where it's like, well, I feel like we're kind of gypping them a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that was like, I think our shortest episode was the Goon Squad getting taken down by Jason. And one of the things that I was surprised by the most was how difficult it was to have to stage all of these things and kind of block out what happened and where people were and what they were doing, because if that had been a movie that we were describing, we would have been able to talk about like, well, this guy went into the woods and then there was that part where he tripped, and that was cool how Jason was like right behind him. We had to invent those things. And when you're not physically on the set seeing your surroundings and you're having to come up with this stuff completely whole cloth, that was much more difficult than I was expecting. even with the outline to guide us, because you have to consider specific movements. And so like, I feel like that, while it was our shortest episode, it just, we had to gloss over a lot that, we could have had a 13 minutes of screen time with that whole sequence, but it just, we would have had to be describing it and not inventing it in the moment. So yeah, I know, I was bummed that was a short episode, but it would have been just really difficult to lengthen that sequence out from a description standpoint.
It was, and I think the best way to kind of like describe that visually is like, if you're looking at an outline, what we were talking about on mic were kind of like the main bullets, and what we didn't have were those sub bullets that you would have if you were watching a movie, where you see like those finer details of people running through the woods. They trip, they fall, they do this. They try to call someone, their phone doesn't work. Like, we didn't have those sub bullets. Our outline was like the main bullets. And so we were going off of that. And I think my biggest takeaway from this season was, so like, Greg, you know this, I may have mentioned this on the podcast before, but like, I'm a writer. Like, my job title is a writer, but it's not like fun writing, it's like business writing. But like, in my free time, I do like to write, and I've written my fair share of screenplays over the years. And whenever I'm writing something, I have never shared a first draft with anybody, even my wife. Like, I will write a first draft and I'll look at it and I'll find flaws in it, and I write a second draft. And so, like, at the very least, the first thing I show my wife, who's probably the first person that sees anything that I write, is a second draft. And the way I view this season 13 of the podcast is, it was a first draft, and it made me actually, like, as like a creative person, it made me kind of uncomfortable at times, where I'm like, oh, why are we releasing this? Like, it's not ready. Like, there's just so many other things that we should be talking about. And like, I gave ourselves the benefit of the doubt, because we were working off a pretty vague outline, because we wanted to keep it vague. Because again, we didn't want to just seem like we were just reading something on mic. We wanted to kind of have that spontaneity and that like kind of like improv nature to it. But like, there were times where I was squirming, and I was like, oh, I wouldn't have done this. Like, I wouldn't have shown anyone that, or like, why isn't this happening? So like, that was probably my biggest struggle with listening back to this, especially after I've like edited the episodes and like actually listening to the story part of it, not the off mic brainstorming stuff, but just like the full story, like what the listeners were hearing. And I was just like, oh, it was just frustrating that like, we couldn't have taken it a little bit further. And like, and I'm not saying we're going to do this and talk about masturbating, but like, I almost feel like it would be fun to do another season where we take the outline that was crafted out of season 13 of the podcast recording, and take that a step further, and like dig into it and get into those like sub bullet points of what was happening between the kills, and what was happening with the characters when they weren't in the middle of an action sequence. And we're not going to do that, but it was like, there was that desire in me to like want to like, I wish we could take this story a little bit further and kind of like flesh it out a little bit more and make it more interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that you took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say that my summary of how I felt when I listened to the finished edited episodes, when I did my my quality check listen before you released them, was, this is a pretty solid first draft. I was pleased with how how stitched together it was, and I think overall it hung together pretty well. But it was a first draft, and I felt like the biggest flaw in our story is that it's really not Ginny's story at all, and yet she's the one with the triumphant ending. And I mean, our story is really more about Megan. So, I mean, I think that there would be further discussions on a second draft about how to address that structural problem. But, I came away with it thinking like, okay, this isn't perfect, but for our first shot, it's not bad. It's not bad. I don't love it, but it's not bad.
That's how I felt too. Like I'm not embarrassed by what we put out. It's just there were things that, again, if this was something that I had written as a first draft, I would have, because like I'm the type of person that just like writes and then just keeps writing until the end and then goes back and read it. Because if I go back and read while I'm writing, then I never finish it. So like after I listened to season 13, like I started creating a checklist of things that I wish we had done better. And like you said, Greg, the character arcs of Megan and Ginny were the two biggest things. Like Ginny would just like disappear. And we even would joke, like kind of like as side comments, like, well, what's Ginny doing during all this? We're like, I don't know. She's sitting in the car, I guess. And like, we really didn't know what to do with her. And in a second draft, I feel like we would have come up with something to do with Ginny and giving her more to do, because like, particularly in that last scene at the construction site where everything's going down, we kind of like glaze over the fact that like, yeah, Ginny's there with Megan, but we don't talk about what Ginny's actually doing that whole time.
She's not doing a damn thing.
It's because we didn't know what she was doing. Like, well, what is she going to do? Like, is she like sitting in the back of the police car and then after a while she decides to get out? Like, we didn't know. And in a second draft, we would have figured that out. I think Megan probably, in terms of like a character arc, probably has more development, because at least like, I don't know, like she's developed into, like, she's the sheriff of the town. So like she's grown in from that standpoint. She investigates something. She kind of uncovers a bunch of facts that lead to the final showdown. And yeah, she ends up getting killed at the end, but like, I feel like there's a stronger story with Megan there, where with Ginny, it's like, she just kind of like shows up. She kind of like tags along with Megan, and we had talked about that too. Like, well, why would she even be with Megan? She's not a cop. She's a psychiatrist. And it's like, well, but she's just with Megan because they're somehow connected. And so that was a little frustrating, but then, you know, Ginny did get that big moment at the end, but whether or not she earned that because of what happened to her in part 2, but she didn't earn that because of what we built her up to be in part 13.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, you know, I mentioned to you, like, superficially, that ending was unintentionally similar to H2O, which I've only seen once, and it was like 15 years ago. I'm not the biggest Michael Myers fan in the world, so I had only, you know, seen that movie and didn't remember much about it at all. But I was listening to the Gorley and Rust podcast. They just released their old episodes on Halloween on their Patreon. And so I was listening to the H2O episode, and I'm like, oh shit, Jamie Lee Curtis cuts off his head at the end. Now I think ours is nicely packed with some additional meaning, with like the camp being destroyed and, you know, Jason kind of losing his power in a way that, you know, adds some interesting subtext that H2O didn't have. But I was like, oh, well, shit, you know, we've already had a movie where the heroine from 20/40 years ago comes back and cuts off the killer's head, and that ends the saga. Granted, Halloween had sequels after that, but so yeah, that coupled with the fact that it was a payoff for Ginny, but not really in our movie, that screams out for a little bit of another pass on the script.
I don't have too much of a problem with, like, I mean, I have no problem with cutting off Jason's head at the end of the movie, because I feel like that's the only way you can kill Jason, especially based on what's happened throughout the franchise. I mean, in particular, the first movie with obviously Pamela Voorhees getting her head cut off. Like, there's supposed to be symbolism there, and you would think that cutting off Jason's head is the only way to truly kill him. Now, what we didn't talk about was the post-credit sequence where Ginny eats Jason's heart.
Don't even. Just don't even.
But in all seriousness, like the only way that we could consider, because I remember during our brainstorm recording where we were like, we had gotten to the point where it was like the final scene of the movie. We were like, well, how do we kill Jason? And I think it was you, Greg, that were like, what if Ginny just cuts his head off? And we kind of like sat there and we're like, yeah, like that's absolutely what has to happen. Like, one, it definitively kills him, and two, there's the symbolism with Pamela Voorhees and his mother, and on the beach, the shores of Lake or Crystal Lake. So it just was the logical way to end it. But there was probably better ways to get to it, and to make it feel earned. But overall, I'm happy with the ending. But there was just little things, mostly character development and like kind of like little nuance of like the in between scenes, because like all of our scenes, I felt like, and when you're writing like a screenplay or a movie, like every scene should try to accomplish something, but there's like those throwaway scenes where it's just kind of like something silly that's happening or whatever, and we didn't have any of that, and nor would we in a first draft. But like I feel like those are the types of things that would have been fun, where like we could have just added some fun, a little bit more fun or depth to the story by throwing in some of those scenes that we just wouldn't have thought about in a first draft.
One of the other things that occurred to me as I was listening to the finished edit of the show was just, I mean, I wish that we had diversified our characters and cast a little bit more. Not for just the sake of like being woke or something, but because a lot of different kinds of people go to see these movies. And so, I mean, they just by nature have become more diverse, and ours is pretty lily white. At one point, like I was considering, when I was coming up with people to cast as the characters, I wanted to have, Megan could be married to like a black guy. And I'm like, but then he's subservient to the rich white guy. And I didn't like that. And so I thought, well, maybe we could make Delaplane, this well-to-do black guy. And that's cool. I would feel bad that he's the villain, but I mean, fine. So, I mean, at one point, I think we were talking about like, Tom Selleck or somebody as Delaplane, but I'm like, what about like Courtney B. Vance? Because he's an intense dude. And I've always enjoyed him, in stuff, and he's been threatening in a couple of things. So I mean, just like we had opportunities for people who don't just look like regular old white folks running around, and I wish we had kind of leaned into that a little bit more.
Right, and some of our casting was purely for comical purposes. Like we were, coming up with ideas, and in fact, I was going for a run, I think it was today actually, and I was listening to part 6, the finale of our podcast, because I'm a weirdo and I listen to my podcast when I run. But you had mentioned Tom Selleck, and I was thinking about jokes that I could have made, and like the biggest, easiest joke for me is like every time we go visit my in-laws in Cincinnati, it doesn't matter what day of the week it is. I feel like Blue Bloods is always on CBS, and they always want to watch it. And every time they just turn it on and they're like, oh, have you guys seen this? And like, we're guests, so we're not going to tell them what to watch on TV, but like we always end up watching Blue Bloods with Tom Selleck. And I was like, God damn it, I could have made a Blue Bloods joke. So I'm making it here. But
because your in-laws listen to the show and they'll appreciate the shout out.
Frequently, yes. They love downloading podcasts. But but yeah, a lot of our casting was just to make each other chuckle. But I agree, there were probably opportunities where we could have made it a little bit more interesting and diverse, and kind of like challenge the typical stereotypes, like the 5 college kids that got slaughtered. Like right. They don't necessarily have to be like the stereotypical jock and the girlfriend of the jock and things like that. Like we could have come up with something a little bit better, but again, first draft, we come up with something different in the second draft, and we refine it a little bit. So not massive regrets.
And I mean, my wife has been, for the first time since we started doing this podcast, she's been listening to the season, each week as it unfolds. But she has not yet heard. We're recording this on the day that the final episode released, and she hasn't listened to it yet. So I don't know what her final thoughts have been. She hasn't said a whole lot the last couple of weeks, which I think, I would attribute to like, those were kind of the killing weeks, and that doesn't interest her so much. And like we said, that episode with the Goon Squad getting taken down, that was probably the one that she zoned out for, because she just doesn't care about that kind of thing. And it's not like it was particularly creative of us in any way. So I think she probably liked the setup episodes more than she did some of these, now the shit has hit the fan episodes. But I'll be curious to know what she thinks of the finale.
My wife did say she liked it. She came home from work today and told me that she liked it, but that was pretty much the extent of her feedback. But
and she's a film critic, so
right, which was weird that she was so concise with her feedback. But yeah, like the episodes where there was lots of kills, like we obviously did that on purpose. We wanted there to be lots of kills, and that was one thing that Greg and I worked on independently, was like, let's just come up with a bunch of really fun kills. And in theory, that was a really good idea. But when we found out, is like, well, shit, we have to set up like why does Jason have a jackhammer in his hand, or why is Jason driving a crane, or like those are the things that we hadn't really figured out. It was just like, Jason kills someone with a crane, Jason kills someone with a jackhammer. And so there was a lot of like on mic, we're like, well, why, like, how do we get from point A to point B, and just kind of figuring it out. Another thing I wish we had done is, like, I would have liked to have seen more. Well, I use the word scene as in like in quotes, but like I would have liked more description of what Jason was doing when all of this shit wasn't going down, because those are some of my favorite moments in the Friday the 13th movies, is when you see kind of Jason lurking or not in killing mode, just kind of like doing something relatively benign. And the Jason that we have in this story, which is like an old decrepit Jason, it would have been kind of cool. Like, well, what does Jason do when he's not plotting the death of a commando unit? And so, like, not that we need a lot of scenes like that, but I just feel like a couple of those sprinkled in throughout the story would have been interesting.
Yeah, that's a good point. When he's like prowling around the camp, sometimes those are the creepiest parts, and we don't really have anything like that. Back to the kills real fast. I mean, the other thing that we ran into, and I think ultimately it worked out for the show for the best, but when you got to the football kill, I was like, oh, okay, so that's what we're doing. It was very different than the tone I had been going with for my kills up to that point. And I think that it was the right call, because it allowed us to start making jokes and stuff. And so for the show, it was appropriate, but it was just like, oh, that's not the kind of kill I would have put in my ideal Jason movie, but I get why you did it. And it certainly is consistent with some of the stuff in the series as a whole.
Right. And that's the kind of like line that we were dancing, which is how much of this content, or how many of these ideas are strictly to make you laugh versus what's actually a good idea. and so we were kind of like dancing around that quite a bit. And so there was like definitely kills that I came up with where I was like, well, Greg's going to think this is funny, but in general, people are going to think it's stupid. One thing that I would like to bring up is from a listener of the podcast, and forgive me if I'm pronouncing the username wrong, but AutoCheck pointed out something that was very accurate and fair, which was that, I don't remember which episode it was. It was the episode where we talk about Ginny and Megan kind of walking through the woods before they get to Ginny's shack, and they're kind of comparing stories about what happened to them. And Ginny's talking about how she never knew what happened to Paul and whether he lived or died. And the comment from AutoCheck was, well, if Paul was alive, don't you think that he would have at least made some effort to like track down Ginny and let her know that she was alive, or he was alive? And I was like, God damn it, you're right. And like, again, like that's like first draft error, where it's like, well, of course, if he was alive, he would have done that, but we didn't really consider that. And so like we should have like mentioned, like we should have like hedged our bets a little bit and been like, yeah, but he didn't have access to the internet or something.
I have to thank this listener for bringing that up, because the same thing occurred to me when I was listening to it, and I realized I had missed the opportunity for an excellent joke, and so now I have the opportunity to say that, and is like, I think Paul may have faked his death to get away from Ginny, just like Olivia Newton-John's boyfriend did when he fled to Mexico.
Well, I think that's going to satisfy all the listeners. Like, that's exactly what they wanted to hear. Right. I mean, it's like, I think the joke that I made to the listener was that maybe Paul didn't heed his own warnings and beware of bears. And maybe he did survive the Jason attack, but ended up getting attacked by a bear later on. But I think the last thing that I want to talk about that we missed in our episodes, was just an unforgivable omission, is that I did not once talk about what kind of car Megan or Ginny drove. So I'll just say that I won't say I think. I'm pretty confident that Ginny drives a Subaru Outback. That just seems like something that kind of like a camping child psychologist kind of hip chick would drive. And then Megan, even though she's a cop, so like when she's not driving a cop car, I think she's a Jeep Wrangler girl.
Wearing Wrangler jeans, driving her Jeep Wrangler.
Absolutely. Okay, so do you have any kind of like final thoughts or wrap ups before we move on, like in terms of how season 13 turned out? Any regrets, any wishes, things like that?
No, nothing beyond what we've already talked about. I thought it was fun. I had a good time doing it. I think, like you say, another crack at it would have been, would have maybe been wise. But I also think that doing it the way we did it kept it organic, and it felt off the cuff enough that, I think anybody who listened to it may have things that, that didn't work so great, or, but I hope that they had fun listening to it and at least consider it a decent first shot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's we've talked about how it like it's a pretty, at least I think it's a pretty solid first draft. Like when we built out the outline, I think we both visualized that there would be 7 or 8 episodes in there, and then as we were recording, we realized that there were just kind of like natural breaks where it was like, oh, this is a good point to kind of like end an episode. Like we don't want to like start the episode in the middle of a scene, so like we were deliberately like coming up with breaks where like a particular scene was going to be the intended end of a particular episode, and that's why we ended up with only 6 instead of 8. So like, we probably could have like fleshed it out a little bit more and made it a little bit more interesting, but I mentioned how, and we're not going to do this because I could tell by the look on Greg's face he had no interest in doing it, but in terms of like doing another season where we would kind of like take this story further, like in podcast form, like we're not going to do that. But one thing that I would consider doing is taking what we came up with in season 13 on the podcast and using that as an outline to write a screenplay and like just write like a season 13, and whether or not that gets shared with anyone beyond you and me is up in the air. But like I feel like that would be a good kind of like challenge, like because I feel like the recordings of season 13 are a good starting point where it's like, yeah, I could absolutely take this and kind of like build it out into something bigger and turn it into a full like 100 minute long movie. So like that's something that's been in the back of my head, whether we do that together or do it independently. But like that was like what, like probably one takeaway that I've had from this season.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, that certainly, if nothing else, it would be a good exercise. If nothing ever came of it, fine. But yeah, I mean, that's certainly not outside the realm of possibility. So what do we want to do next? What's our plan going forward, you might be wondering? What are your thoughts?
Well, that's a damn good question because like you said, we've been teasing season 13 for a while, like because we came up with the season 13 idea probably during like the season 10 or season 11 of the podcast. So like it's been in the back of our mind for a while. And I think we've been teasing it to the listeners since probably the end of season 12. And then definitely when we were doing those like podcast finale episodes, we were like, oh, we've got something big surprise or a big surprise for you coming up. And now we've done it. And we're like, well, for now, what do we do? I don't know. And we deliberately saved this conversation to be on mic because like we have had conversations, like general conversations of what it could be, but I think it's good to kind of like get it on mic too, because then people can respond on social media or whatever they want to do and let us know what they're thinking. But like, it's no surprise that we're out of Friday the 13th content. Yes, there's probably 3 or 4 fan films that we could still talk about. There's 13 Fanboy that we would still talk about, but like, that's only going to take us so far. Like that may take us through the rest of 2022 if we just focused entirely on that. But we have to think about like the future of until there's a new movie. And even if there is a new movie, it could like, even if they announce a new movie today, it could be like 3 years before it comes out. So it's like, well, what are we going to do between there? And we enjoy podcasting. We enjoy doing these recordings together. And so, we've had to kind of like look beyond Friday the 13th and think about like, well, what else could we do? Like we would always come back to Friday the 13th. If there was a new movie that came out, we would absolutely milk the shit out of that and come up with as many episodes as we could. Like we would do like 6 episodes just on the trailer. And then like, you know, who knows how many episodes based on the movie itself, but like we had to kind of like future proof the idea of us working together on a podcast. And like one thing that we've talked about is just because so like when we did the podcast finale episodes, which like that's something that we refer to by name, but for the listeners, those are the ones where we just spent like an hour and a half just kind of like whacking each other off. But
no, that's a very different podcast that we did. You're referring to the recap of the whole series, and we had
that one. But we actually got a lot of good feedback from that, and people are like, oh, I really like the long form episodes. And I agree. I think the long form episodes are fun because it does allow our personalities to come out. We're less restricted by having to cover like very specific things. We can just kind of like do it a little bit more freeform. I think You're All Doomed in terms of like a movie podcast is always going to be 13 minutes at a time. That's the concept that we came up with. That's what we're going to stick with. So if there's ever going to be a new Friday the 13th movie, it's going to be 13 minutes at a time. But I'm also open to the idea of like doing something where we're talking about other movies that we like, and whether it's like, there's part of me that thinks that the 13 minute at a time concept should be reserved for just Friday the 13th. Like that's our thing. And then we have like either another podcast or just episodes that are released on the You're All Doomed feed where we're talking about movies that are not Friday the 13th, where maybe they're just longer form things. Like, I don't know. Like where do you stand on that, Greg?
I mean, I would preface this by saying I think that we should take a summer vacation. We've been working on this podcast pretty much nonstop since we started in some form or another. And even though we've been radio quiet for the last 6 months, we were working on the season 13 thing quite a bit. And I mean, especially you behind the scenes doing all of the heavy lifting on production. So, I mean, I think, we'll probably be quiet for a while here, but I do think that, fall is certainly horror movie season. So, I mean, my thought was, I would prefer to leave the 13-minute structure for the core Jason movies. Even if we talk about 13 Fanboy, I'd rather do that just as like a single chunk. And so, I mean, it's like, why don't we just think of movies that we think would be of interest to the audience and keep it on the You're All Doomed feed so that you all don't have to go searching for our other show. But we won't be talking about Howard's End or anything. We're going to try and think of I suggest we try and think of things like, I want to talk about The Burning. It's the movie that the Weinsteins produced right after Part One came out, and Tom Savini worked on that instead of Friday the 13th Part Two. And that movie is a hoot. It's a camp slasher movie, so I mean, it's like the audience that likes this show would probably enjoy that movie. So I'd be happy to talk about that for an episode, or any other movies that we just think that this audience would enjoy, or movies that we enjoyed with the same history that we share. Or we could make a podcast where we just tell stories from our crazy childhoods where we're playing in the creek all the time. And no, I'm kidding. That would be horrible to listen to. Or our ill-fated homecoming dates and that kind of thing.
Wait,
but yeah, I mean,
wait,
I
hold on
don't
a second.
see
You had a homecoming date? Lucky bastard.
once, yes. So I mean, that's kind of my thought. But I'd certainly be interested to hear what the listeners say. I mean, I know somebody suggested we maybe cover the novelizations, and I mean, I like that idea in theory, but they're hard to get a hold of. They're super expensive, and I stupidly gave my copies away, 20 years ago without realizing that they'd be difficult to get a hold of again. It's also difficult to like talk about a book on a podcast because the reader hasn't necessarily read it. We're not going to read it back and forth to each other, like chapter by chapter or something like that. So I don't know how well that would work. And we tried to cover that a little bit with Part 6 because I think that's the most, dramatic difference between the movie and the novelization, with scenes of young Jason and his father and all that stuff. So I liked the idea, but I'm not sure how well that would work. So in terms of Jason content, other than like if we were live streaming a round of playing the game together, I don't know that there's anything we could do with Jason. So let's try and think of things that are at least similar enough to Jason, or of related interest that we can cover. I mean, like I don't want to go as far as like let's do the Halloween movies, because plenty of other podcasts have done that. There have been Halloween Minute podcasts, but if we can think of things that maybe aren't as mainstream for fans of this genre, that I'd be perfectly happy to cover those in an episode.
I'm kind of like all over the place because this is, believe it or not, the 112th episode of Friday the 13th related content that we've done on You're All Doomed. And so there's part of me that like wants to keep the You're All Doomed podcast feed as just Friday the 13th. Like that's a shitload of Friday the 13th content that just kind of like diverge into something else. So like if we were to like do a separate podcast and again, we don't need to figure this out on mic, but like if we were to do a separate podcast, it's not that big of a deal. We post the episode on here and we're like, hey, check out our new podcast, and you move over to it and you subscribe, and then like that's it. There's no it's like labor. It's not labor intensive to subscribe to a podcast that's like you and I talking about something that's not Friday the 13th. But like I'm also not 100% opposed to just including non Friday the 13th content on here, knowing that there's just no more Friday the 13th content to talk about. I love the idea of doing movies that are like adjacent to Friday the 13th. And while we're probably not going to do Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, things like that, like it's going to be things that are either like influenced by Friday the 13th or things that are interesting to you and I as like movies that we grew up with as children, or grown-up children like we are now, just movies that just mean a lot to us, where we're going to have a lot to say. And if we were to do those long form episodes where it's like an hour and a half or whatever of us talking about whatever movie, if people want to listen to it, cool. But like I like the idea of kind of keeping it separate, because like if someone sees an update for You're All Doomed, they're going to think it's Friday the 13th content. And if it's not, then they may just be like, well, that's kind of a bummer. But if we kind of like keep the non-Friday the 13th content separate in a different podcast, then they know that like whenever they get an update and You're All Doomed, it's going to be strictly Friday the 13th related. And in the end, I don't know if it really matters, but like I go back and forth depending on the day of like, do we just start a different podcast where we just talk about movies that we like and remind people like, hey, we're the guys that used to do You're All Doomed, and they can always go back and listen to it. But until there's new movies to talk about, like there's just not going to be a lot to update on this feed. And so, yeah, if we take the summer off, I think we could probably fill out the rest of the year with the remaining fan films and probably 13 Fanboy. And then that means, I mean, if you're listening to this in real time, that means in like 2023, we'd have to figure out like, okay, what are we doing? Like, are we going to continue to update the You're All Doomed feed, or are we just going to do a completely different podcast where we talk about different movies? And if people join us because they just like Brian and Greg, then great. And if not, then fuck you. But
that's a way to win them over.
Right.
I'd be interested to hear what the listeners think. So, I mean, if you're listening to this and you have thoughts, I would encourage you to shout us out on social media and let us know what you would prefer. I mean, I guess my pitch would be, to you, Brian, is, You're All Doomed as a name came from Friday the 13th, specifically in our case, Friday the 13th Part 2, but it's not necessarily, it's not like we called it the Jason Show, or it could apply to anything. So I would almost like, what if we called these, tangent movies like, spin-off episode? Because there are always spin-offs from a successful franchise, and if you want to consider our show a successful franchise, we could just have, hey, spin-off episode, and we talk about, The Burning or Delta Force 2, and then people will know in the feed, like if we call it a spin-off episode, they know it's not Friday the 13th, but it's still going to be the same ethos that we brought to the Friday the 13th movies.
Right. And yeah, and we can go back and forth about like the merits of either one. And I don't know if I have a strong feeling about either one, whether it's like continuing just on the current podcast feed or starting a new one. But like my feeling was, it's like the perfect example is like Greg, like a podcast you and I both listen to a lot, is Matt Gorley and Paul Rust. They started off doing a podcast where they were talking about Friday the 13th, and it was called in Voorhees We Trust. But they did 12 episodes before they switched gears and decided to go into like Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street. And every season they changed their name. And so it's like I was more forgiving of that format change because they did 12 episodes and moved on. Like we've done 112 episodes of Friday the 13th. And for us to like suddenly change our format, like it's fine. Like you said, like people they just don't have to listen to that episode. It's fine. But it's like, there's this certain like I want to like kind of like preserve the like the sanctity of the concept and be like, no, this is a Friday the 13th podcast. Like that's how we branded ourselves. And it's like Friday the 13th, 13 minutes at a time. And then suddenly it's like, well, now it's like Howard's End 11 minutes at a time or like whatever. So
the piano.
Yes, that would be a laugh riot. So yeah, I don't know, but yes, if you're on social media, absolutely let us know what you think. I may even like, I don't know if I know that Instagram doesn't allow us to do it. Maybe I don't think Facebook does, but like Twitter, if you want to like jump on Twitter, I might throw up a poll in the next week or so and just kind of like see what people think. We have an email address, I think, that I don't know if we've ever utilized, but I think it's yadpodcast@gmail.com. So like email that, see what happens. See who responds. But I'm fairly certain that that's connected to my email account. So if you're not on social media, God bless you. Maybe just send us an email and let us know what you think. But I don't think it's a big deal to kind of like direct people to a different podcast and just to be like, hey, we've got a new podcast and we post it once on You're All Doomed. And if they're interested, they subscribe to the new one and then they never have to do anything again. It's just part of their feed, but we'll see. But yeah, I think either way, we'll kind of like wrap up what we feel is the most important Friday the 13th content remaining, which is, a handful of fan films and 13 Fanboy. And then we'll just see. but it'll probably just be some movies that we love, or whether they're horror movies or not. But yeah, we absolutely would love to hear, because as much as we love to masturbate on mic, we like to know what our listeners want to hear. And if we did hear from people that said that they really liked us just kind of like yammering on for those 1.5 hour long episodes. So if that's what people like, then maybe we just find some excuses to do that. But
I wonder if there's a Friday the 13th porn parody that we could cover 13 minutes at a time.
Jason Takes Manhattan is kind of like a built-in porn film.
Jason Goes to Hole.
The Rebooty.
The Final Spasm.
Friday the 13th, Part 3, Double D.
Friday the 13th, Part 5, The New Behiny.
Friday the 13th, Part 6, Jason Gives.
I was going to go with Jason Licks. Okay. I think we hit them all.
No, we forgot about Jason Triple X.
Well, that one was just like, such an obvious, like.
Oh, sorry, Greg. Before we wrap up, I would like to give a shout out to another podcast I've been listening to recently called And the Podcast Will Rock. And it is a podcast that goes through the Van Halen catalog one song at a time. And for anyone that has known me for as long as Greg, they know that my first love was actually Van Halen. It was not Friday the 13th. I was a kind of scary, obsessive Van Halen fan growing up. And so I really enjoyed listening to their podcast, and they literally spin a wheel every episode, and that each week the wheel lands on a particular song, and then they have to talk about it. And one of the things that I like is that neither of them are massive Van Halen fans. Like when I first heard about the concept of the podcast, I was like, oh, Greg, this would have been something I totally would have done. Like, why didn't I do a Van Halen podcast one song at a time? But what I like about it is that like they're both fans, but like they both have limited, or they both have like kind of like blind spots. Like one is more kind of familiar with like the greatest hits of Van Halen, where one of them is more familiar with Van Halen. And so when they have their conversations, there's a lot of just really good talks about what they like and what they don't like. And so I've really enjoyed it, and I've been listening to it every week, and I've been commenting. They've been kind enough to shout out, not necessarily me because I'm commenting as You're All Doomed, the podcast, but they've been very kind to read some of my stupid comments. So if you are even remotely interested in Van Halen or interested in learning more about Van Halen, definitely check out And the Podcast Will Rock. They come out pretty much every week. So it's been fun, and they're like maybe 20 episodes in. So it's not too daunting of a task to get caught up, but I've really enjoyed listening to them, and have already let them know that I hope to be a guest on a future episode. So hopefully that works out.
Nice.
So you have any final thoughts, Greg?
No, I don't think so. I think that, if people listened and made it through this season, thank you. I know that hearing other people's ideas for stories may not always be the most interesting thing in the world, but we did try to make it fun. So I hope you enjoyed it, and we appreciate you hanging in with us. And, like we always say, we will be back. There will be another Jason movie at some point in the future. So when that happens, we will be there for all of it, like Brian says. And you'll get, initial reaction episodes, and then we'll do the 13-minute chunk episodes. So, keep us in the feed. We may have longer gaps between content, but we're not going away forever. So, thanks again, and, just have a good summer and take care. Don't go to camp.
So to find out what happens after Ginny bites into Jason's heart, tune in to the next season, whenever that is, of You Are All Doomed.